good few people joining us. Good to see some familiar faces. Welcome back to our Masterclass series. So this afternoon, this Masterclass, the guys, Niall and Phil, are going to be talking about how you can design a clear action plan for decarbonisation. So I'll introduce our two panelists. We have Philip O'Reilly, who's a data acquisition engineer with us in Cool Planet, and Niall McGee, who is operations performance manager with us in Cool Planet. Guys have a great masterclass with lots of information for you, simple steps, couple of case studies, etc. Before we kick off and I hand over to the gentleman, there's a chat box at the bottom of the screen, Q&A. Please drop any questions that you have this afternoon into the chat box, into the Q&A, and we'll take time at the end. We'll take about 5 minutes at the end to answer your questions. So I'm going to hand over to the gentleman.
Thanks very much, Sinead. Appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. As Sinead said, it's great to see some familiar faces and also some new faces too who we haven't met. So welcome aboard. Myself and Phil today are going to talk you through, as Sinead mentioned, our how to design a clear action plan for decarbonisation. We are going to have sort of 3 sections that we will take you through. First, and it's kind of 4 questions really. What and why are we doing this? Who should be involved in it? And then how are we going to get there? So 3 kind of very simple sets of questions to ask yourself, and they ultimately unravel, and as you will see later, iterate over themselves to come up with your plan. So, we just start off with some very basic questions about your targets, your goals, what you want to get out, and how you get there. So if we want to move on then. First question, Phil, we'd ask is what is decarbonisation?
Yeah, absolutely. So decarbonisation it's obviously a very current buzzword at the moment in the media, and pretty much everywhere you go, you can barely turn on the radio or the television without hearing about decarbonisation. And it can be a pretty daunting one to actually deal with, I think. We talk about this in our daily lives every day now to our clients and prospective clients, and everyone's trying to figure out a way to come up with a plan. It can be, as I said, a very, very daunting task. There's these numbers going around like 2035, 2040, 2050, whatever it happens to be. And they seem like pretty mammoth tasks. I guess one of the targets of today's discussion over the next 35 minutes or so is to kind of break things down and make it that little bit less daunting for you guys obviously out there, and whatever industry you happen to be in, whether you're currently sitting in a commercial building or in an industrial plant, you're manufacturing beer, bottles for the beer, meat, whatever it happens to be, and just break this down over the next 35 minutes. Hopefully make things a little bit clearer.
So I guess 3 of the things that people would have heard before is about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We're going to start with that. So scope 3 is basically what happens outside your plant. So your suppliers and the energy uses they have. Scope 2 being, your imported electricity and gas. So indirect emissions that are outside your
any of your incomes.
And scope 1 being what you burn on site directly, so solid fuel burning on site, diesel generators, and consumption like that. So where you can really focus on yourself is scope 1 and 2. But if you ultimately remember that your scope 1 and 2 become somebody else's scope 3, the more of us that get on board with decarbonisation plans and registers and doing things correctly, the easier it all becomes for every one of us. So if we all worry about ourselves, we can look after each other as well. And while net zero is a big term that people have kind of bandied around and people are striving for, decarbonisation doesn't have to be full net zero to start. We can take small incremental steps. It doesn't have to be 100%, but yes, hopefully we will all get to net zero, but we can't just jump from our usage now to our usage in 2050. We have to break this down into smaller goals. So how do we get to net zero? Well, there's 3 kind of steps that we use here at Cool Planet, and we would recommend other people to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. So as some of you may know, our software, Clarity, is our software platform to run the net zero transition. So this is a platform that takes in data that you have in whatever industry you happen to be in. It is able to organize the data, build digital twins out of the data, and present some very nice outcomes with that data. And we can start small. We'll talk about starting with 2 data points later on, all the way up to, we've got clients with 10,000 data points on their Clarity platform. But it has the expertise to keep you on track, obviously, with targets as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the opportunity.
I think it's important, Phil, just to recognize that not everyone would have our platform in place.
Absolutely.
So you can start with your own HMIs, PLCs, whatever BMSs you've got yourself. It doesn't. To start off, you can work with the tools that you have, and then yes, it'd be great if you'd like to talk to us about Clarity. But start off with the tools you have, and then build out your plans. So the final step there, which we haven't touched on yet, is the education. It's a massive step that really quite often gets overlooked. We find people get tasked with something, and we'll touch on that later on. People get tasked with something and go, yeah, that's handled. But education of staff and other stakeholders is important, because the operator leaving the light switch on or leaving the machine running, ultimately he's not quite often in historic cases reporting on that energy usage. So education of everyone is important. So looking typically historically at our customers and people we meet, everyone's facing this climate change fight, and traditionally only 9% of companies measure their emissions comprehensively, and as few as 11% have actually done any reduction in the past year in line with targets. People are setting lofty targets and just not achieving it. And one of the big issues that we see, and a massive part of any plan, is you cannot reduce what you cannot measure. It's number one key. If you're looking to lose weight, you weigh yourself at the start, you weigh yourself as you go on. If you're looking to run faster, you measure yourself for a distance. No matter what you do, decarbonisation is no different to that. Measure everything, and you need to do that.
Absolutely, and this is something we come across quite often as well. And I've been talking to a number of clients, as we all do, on a regular basis, and sometimes they ask us for justification around certain metrics and KPIs and meters, whatever there might be, or systems that they have on their sites. And over the last number of years, we've come across people saying that, we don't necessarily need to measure that, it's such a small load. But what was such a small load 2 years ago, pre-energy crisis, now may still be a small load, but it's a significant amount more in terms of obviously cost. And I know we're obviously focusing on decarbonisation here, but obviously it all intertwines. And I think it's very, very important to know that something that may have been just small and insignificant a couple of years ago now is becoming something that's very, very current and needs to be measured and acted upon.
Yeah, and just on that one, you mentioned about setting your goals. So one of the questions we asked there was, who's setting the goals and who's measuring them? So who's setting the targets, and why are they setting them? Are we doing this because someone else has told us to? So one of the key questions to ask would be, who is responsible for decarbonisation on your plant or your site, your facility? The answer is very simple. All of us. We all play part, from C-suite level all the way down to the lower levels of the organisation. Every single person in there plays part, and they all need to have a why. It can't just be, oh, my boss told me to. We need buy-in.
Absolutely, and I think it's important just to come back to targets. I mentioned earlier on about there's targets out there for 2035, 2050. A target doesn't necessarily have to be something that's set out on a governmental organization. It can be something on a very, very local level. It might be just local in terms of your geographical location. It could be local in terms of your plant. It could be just the people that you happen to be in the same office with. I heard a good one this morning actually with a client. They were saying that one of the operators from one of our clients went into the room where all the accountants were sitting, and he said the place was about 28 degrees. So that's certainly an opportunity there for decarbonisation right there and then on a very, very local level. So I just thought it was a particularly good one there. But as I said, everyone's responsible for this. There's no role that's too small for someone to be responsible for decarbonisation at this point that we're at the moment.
And I think one of the important messages to drive home with all the staff is and people involved is that okay, yes, they're getting involved in this, we're educating on it, But these changes don't have to make your job harder. It can also make your job easier and more efficient. It can help you build a case for getting the tools or equipment that you've been asking for, and you've been told it costs too much, or it can be help you achieve better uptime, more efficiency. If all you're worried about is throughput, well, decarbonisation can also lead to help better throughput. It's not just about keeping the plant on. Keeping it on so that it won't need maintenance is important, and that helps. Efficient machines need less maintenance and have less downtime, so produce more. And the point that you made there is really good about the operator walking into the accounts. We would always recommend any of our customers build an energy team, and that energy team should have representatives of all of the different departments.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an important part. So those operators should be talking to the accountants, should be talking to the maintenance team, the engineering, manufacturing, planning, procurement.
I think it's important as well. We come across so many different teams in our day-to-day work, and we understand that a lot of the time people are just trying to get on with the job they're doing, whether it be that group of accountants who are just trying to work out profits for next year, whether it happens to be an operator that's trying to get the best product out of the factory. But we also have to understand that a lot of these things are intertwined with decarbonisation, as well as energy savings, as well as cost reduction as well. So what one person might think is just being to really, really streamline a production process, another person might be looking at that in an entirely different way. They might be looking at it from a point of decarbonisation, and it's when these people come together and they use either a universal platform like Clarity or whatever you're using to actually collate your data, is when you start really seeing the benefits of it all.
So moving along your plan, there's kind of 4 topics that we kind of want to look at, and it's what do you want to achieve? Is my goal net zero by 2050? Is it 2025 30% reduction? So that's end goal, but what's your timescale on that? We can't just let it slide up until 2049 and then go, okay, now we need to worry about it. So what's your timescale to achieve the mission you're setting out right now? And then within that, you need to subdivide it into what are your short and long-term goals. So you need to think about your 25-year plan, your 5-year plan, your annual,
also for the next number of weeks, months, things like that.
Your quarterly.
All these small milestones make up.
So you need to break your milestones down into maybe quarterly is probably or a few weeks depending on how your production or how you operate. So seasonal, or think about that helps you to think about things like when's your next shutdown going to be. So we need to put in place a plan for the short term, because we need to have a certain amount achieved by the shutdown so that we can replace equipment or maintain equipment that needs to happen during shutdown. Because if we wait till next year, well, we have to wait maybe another 11 months for another shutdown after we planned it. So break those milestones down, and then think about certification. It's a more and more important role in a lot of companies nowadays. A lot of boards and shareholders are looking for ISO 50001, and it helps recognize the hard work that you're probably going to be doing anyway. So think about whether you want that certification, and if you don't necessarily want it now, think about it for the future, because all of the hard work that you put in at the start and putting in place the procedures, that can be the framework in the future for your ISO 50001. It doesn't have to be right now, but don't have to rewrite your book in 5 years' time when you decide you do want to go for it.
I think also important to note on that point as well, obviously ISO 50001 is one of the most talked about certifications out there at the moment, and one of the most important, of course. But there's a lot to be said also as well. We deal with big organizations every day. There's a lot to be said for some degree of self-certification as well, kind of like a scorecard depending on your plant and things like that. Kind of almost like a competition to a certain extent. And stuff like that can probably be an awful lot more manageable. It's not this big ISO 50001 chunk that can sometimes be, just like decarbonisation, quite daunting.
So to make things a little bit less daunting, we talked about starting with just 2 points, 2 data points. And here's a real life example of where we've done that. So we looked at this facility, and we said, just from remaining incoming data, can we achieve a level of decarbonisation? And it's really surprising. This is a great example where we took the mains gas for the building, and then we have the operating hours.
Yeah.
And I know I'll let you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, there's no amount of data that's too small to start here. So we've got clients that have got just 2 data points coming into us. It can be, sometimes, like I said, a very daunting task to start looking at 1,000 data points to fulfill a site or a clarity account, which is what we do quite regularly. But 2 points can be a huge amount of information to build out where the starting point is, I guess. So as I said, we're looking at the likes of a main gas and a main electrical incomer here, coming from a data aggregator for quite a large suite of commercial buildings in the UK. And you can see quite clearly there when we started working with this particular client sometime around May there, and we started implementing some changes in June, just based on the operating conditions of the building. You can see quite a significant reduction there through those next couple of months there. And then even towards the latter part of the year, the consumption obviously does start to increase, but certainly the overall baseline is certainly less than it was when we started off with them. So as I said, no amount of data is too small to start with, and that's your building block then from there on then.
Yeah, so you can see like we were able to achieve 46% nearly reductions just from looking at the main incomer and saying, okay, what big consumers are operating outside of our production hours, or outside of our facility hours. And for those of us joining from the UK, this is a fairly straightforward one, because most facilities will now have a data aggregator as part of the regulations that got brought in. So that data is freely available. For Irish people joining us, we have the likes of the MRSO data that we can request historically, the 30-minute breakdown, and look at something similar. Where this is also quite good is bill validation. We've done that first for some people, and as part of the plan, it was important to check that, as with our other meters where we check the accuracy of things, is to just check that the meters are adding up to actual usage, because we've quite quickly found before where there's been lots of overcharges, and then your baseline doesn't reflect what your cuts need to be. So having a good baseline data is very important. So validate all of that before we start. You mentioned a score, a fitness tracker, or a health score for your site. So KPIs are very, very important to our customers, and we try to constrain our measurements to try to drive ourselves towards increased optimization. These health scores, a lot of people are familiar with a high level one of, main electricity to production, or square footage of your, if you're a commercial building, square footage to energy consumption. And they're great, but you'll see more and more with modern fitness trackers, those goals shift. So, you do 10,000 steps today, tomorrow it might say, okay, try 11,000.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's important that we keep that in mind with our monthly goals, our quarterly goals. Okay, great, we've achieved our KPI for 3 months in a row. Let's try and see, can we better it? There's no point in remaining static. So you have to be open to review those health scores.
I think that's a particularly important one as well now, because a KPI can sometimes measuring just one metric, but while a KPI might remain static, you give the example there of someone that's hit a KPI 3 months in a row. Most likely what's happened is they've hit the KPI 3 months in a row, but the cost of that energy may have increased exponentially over those 3 months. So as one thing goes up, something else kind of needs to go down if you're to stay around that baseline.
And it's important as well to think of your mix of fuels. So your KPIs remain the same, but has the carbon load of that remained the same? So are you using the same fuel source? Is your tons of CO2 equivalent for that fuel source the same? So, in terms of monetary value, it's one thing, but also in terms of in this context where we're talking about decarbonisation, have we just switched to a cheaper source that may also have a bigger carbon
footprint? Exactly. That's obviously not what we're advocating at all.
So one of the ways that we see people being able to target some of these KPIs and health scores is through an opportunity register. So when you see an opportunity for a new health score, or for increasing metric, or for a new project, it's important to record that down. So that can drive from the base level. And this comes back to getting everyone involved again.
Yeah.
So, we discussed having input from everyone, and we've seen a lot of facilities where there's some great ways in place for staff to recommend savings, or particularly you see it for health and safety risks or other improvement. People write down a forum, suggestion box. It's important for that to be captured, to be seen somewhere, and for the person who had suggested it to see it being followed through to fruition, because otherwise people won't suggest again. Like if I suggested my idea tomorrow and it's great, it goes into a black hole to die, why am I going to suggest something else? So when we get the buy-in from everyone on site, it's important to have a central register where we can track that from idea through to being in progress and realized or abandoned, and track the reasons why, because just because something is put on hold or abandoned right now doesn't mean in 6 months time or 6 years time it doesn't come back around to being valuable again, because maybe the cost to savings will be more beneficial then, or or reduction in CO2 will be more available then. So
I think what we're seeing on the screen here now is the opportunity registers, an example from Clarity, but it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's in a software platform. An opportunity register can be an Excel file that's shared amongst your team, amongst the organization. And it just allows people to see what the thoughts are, I guess, amongst the wider team in terms of what opportunities could be presented. And like I mentioned earlier on, just because a production manager may be striving for a better product, and then you might have also an energy manager that's looking for a lower overall consumption. Those two things can then start to intertwine, and you might start to open that conversation within your organization and go, well, look, there's something here that I want to do, and in turn this is also going to help you out as well. So it doesn't so much give accountability or anything like that, but more just opens the conversation. We're not trying to hold people accountable for anyone's actions here. It's more just a case of opening the conversation and working together as a team, obviously, and with that buy-in from a whole team, you're going to get your conversation go much easier.
So one of the nice things that we like to include on our opportunity register is assigning accountability, or assigning somebody with responsibility for an idea, or coming up with great, you're the person who suggests this, who else is going to work on it, a place to track notes on what progress has been made, what fleshing out the idea a bit more, and ideally linking it to some sort of data. So as we investigate further, we can build a dashboard or a report on the concept where we think the savings might be achieved, and then as we'll discuss later, probably tracking that idea. So come up with an idea, suggest how much we think it might save us, implement it, and then make sure that we continue to implement it after it's come to fruition, which is why we still track things that have been realized, because we want to continue that realization and making sure that we're still keeping that reduction over time to come.
It's something we see quite often. Again, people make savings, they implement an opportunity, and then without the visualization of that opportunity or the work that was done, things can start to slip. We come across it actually quite often in fridge plants, where there can be a lot of manual intervention with certain things. And things can obviously be implemented. They go for certain settings at certain times of the year, but those settings may not apply to a different time of the year. And that's when you start to need to take a step back, look at the data, look at the opportunity in the process, and maybe just readjusting. You're readjusting your KPI as a second to that.
That's an important part of having all the data tracked centrally. So if you've 6 months' time you've forgotten, we were supposed to revert it. Here you've got your note of going back onto it.
You can see exactly.
So, okay, everybody knows what they're doing. Everyone knows why they're doing it. We've started with our 2 data points. We've come up with a few ideas. Where do we go from there? This journey isn't finished ever. Unfortunately, there's no quick magic bullet, but what we do is we iterate over the site. So we started main incomer. Okay, we've got ideas from that. That's great. What about our SEUs? So what's our high level users? Is it manufacturing and storage and operations? There's our next users. Then within that, we've got some ideas. Let's dig further. We've got 2 air compressors, 4 boilers. Let's dig down further. So it's this constant iterative process of setting targets. Okay, let's go the next level down, the next level down. While we do that, it really helps us to understand our own site properly, customers think they know what's happening on their site, and then when they start to dig in, they go, oh, we did that project and that electrician tapped in off that wire instead of where I thought it was being fed from, or you know, we had somebody who
we've dozens of examples of this actually. It's amazing to see it sometimes, and you know, it's only really when you start looking you know, in depth at these things, you start looking at, you know, one meter versus another meter, and you see, oh, that doesn't quite look right. You know, any other time you might have looked at it, you might have been noting it down on a piece of paper, sticking it into an Excel sheet, but you're never actually really digging into the data. But you know, it's quite often, I think you were going to give an example there.
So you know, we found recently on a site where there was a company charging subcharging to a tenant some of the electricity usage they had. And for years it's been billed, but actually tracing the cables, we discovered there was 2 other loads feeding off that main wire. So there was a security hut and another building. So, you know, for years I went, oh, that's the meter for that, but actually it wasn't. So things like that are important, but it can be a much smaller impact than that and still be valuable for understanding. So what we always say is, you know, what pipes are feeding what equipment and what meters are measuring those pipes. It'll surprise you sometimes. Then we need to understand what is our current reporting. And, you know, we've quite often find people are doing the same reporting for 10, 20, 30 years. And they've lost the reason as to why they're doing it, but they still do it because that's how it was always done. So take a look at your reporting and ask yourself, why are we doing this? Is this the best way, and should we revisit it?
And we see a lot of absolutely mammoth Excel sheets that come out of that kind of thing as well. And it's someone's job to go and fill these in on a regular basis, be it daily, weekly, monthly, whatever. And that then gets sent to a different department. And
that's one of the
time that takes is huge.
That's one of the key reasons why you need the input from every team. Because, you know, I'm producing the report because accounts need it, and accounts go, actually, we don't need that. We're just doing it because Joe wants it. So having somebody from each department can really understand why you're actually doing something. So why are we doing it? Is it valuable now? So are we reporting on the right things? Actually, we were doing that when we were producing product A, but we're not producing that product anymore, so it's not relevant. So ask yourself those questions. You know, where is feeding what, and why are we reporting on it? When we look back 5 years ago, we didn't produce any carbon reports, and now 40% of customers have it. People are changing why they're reporting it.
And we're seeing customers that don't necessarily have to, but they want to, just from you know, an environmental conscious point of view.
So we know where the energy is being used. We know what we're reporting. Then let's use that to build a case. You know, so we have suggestions. We have our list of ideas. Let's track it. Take the assumptions we have, and using the data, measure up, does it correlate with the suggestions we have? And we have the age-old question of, we know this costs us money, but we don't have time to fix it because we just need to keep operations going. Well, the question, we flip it on our head and we ask ourselves, how much is it costing it not to fix it? You know, okay, that's a 10,000 euro project, that's a 100,000 euro project. But every month, are we wasting 10, 20, 30,000 euro in energy because we're not fixing that right now? And there's ways around it. You know, there's financing available. You know, we often deal with that with a lot of customers. Or, you know, looking long term, it's easier to get approval when you have a big case of evidence, data behind it to show this is what we're wasting, this is how much we can save. We saw in Ireland, carbon tax, the cost of carbon credits has increased massively just last night, overnight. We were all expecting it, but, you know, let's revisit the projects that we couldn't do last year because it was 10% less. Let's look at it now and say, is it viable for us to look at those projects again? They were good ideas, but they didn't. The cost didn't back it up. We've been continuing to build that case for the last year. So even though it's kind of on hold, we're still building up that body of evidence to say, okay, it's time to revisit it and let's go ahead with it.
And we deal quite a lot as well with clients and trying to get the business case about, you know, doing these projects or installing more metering or installing more systems to actually measure their consumptions. And quite often, you know, the business case can just fall out of some very, very light data. And, you know, it's kind of coming back to your your example about the carbon tax, 10 years ago, it was so much money to put solar panels on the roof of your house, and it was going to take 10, 15 years to actually get the cost back. If you look at that comparison versus now, you'll find that you probably get the cost of those solar panels back then a couple of years in comparison, just 100%. Because one thing has changed and yet the other thing hasn't. It can just be one of those metrics that can drive the other.
So the tools for that body of evidence, we've mentioned already the opportunity register. That's one way that's really important. But the other is the kind of tacit knowledge, or the knowledge that gets lost traditionally in conversations or emails. So this would be an example where, a real life example where we have alerts coming from rules that we've set to say, if we have excessive consumption on particular lines when there's no production, let them know, and we kind of get a reply from the customers, and it gets tracked then. So in this example, quite quickly, by monitoring the energy usage or the water usage, the customer saw that there was a slight crack on a production line on one of the water valves, and then if that was let slide over time, that crack could lead to failure, and then all of a sudden you're wasting huge amounts of energy. One of the important things that we've discovered the last 2-3 years is the importance and the impact that supply has on the supply chain has, and logistics are just getting to be a nightmare. We've got lead times of 6 weeks being pushed out to 6 months in a year, depending on it. So catching those early interventions is really, really important, and having that tracked and somewhere to write that down and central resource to share that is really important. So I can't just say to John, oh yeah, there's a bit of a crack there. I need to have it in the system, in the opportunity register, and say, if we don't do anything about this small crack, it could lead to complete failure, and then we're wasting massive amounts. So that's a real life example of where something like that would come from.
Absolutely, it's going back to how much it costs to not fix something.
Yeah, so we have this circular event of sort of 5 steps that we talk about. So the trigger event in this case was that email to say, there's a slight crack. Or the trigger event was the notification to say we've excessive usage. Investigation led to us saying there's a slight crack. Then we need to look at how do we diagnose and develop a solution. Okay, in this case, it's simple. We need to get a new part in and refit it. For another case, it might be, we need our mains incoming electricity, we're noticing a creep up in the cost. We're noticing a change in the carbon sources. It's costing us too much. How do we develop a new solution? Or maybe let's think about solar. Let's look at batteries. Okay, let's go ahead with that. As you said, we expect a payback in a couple of years as opposed to a decade as before. Implement the changes, do your project, and then make sure you're sustaining that. So, okay, just because I've installed the solar doesn't mean that they're keeping clean, they're giving us the best power outage. We've installed them in the right location at the right angle. So we need to say, are we measuring that progress, making sure that we're achieving the savings? And if not, perhaps that triggers another event for us to investigate further and say, okay, we're not getting the payback we planned. Why not? Did we subsequently put an annex onto the building that's now blocking the light to those solar panels? So it's a circular thing that we constantly need to be aware of. Question ourselves, develop an answer, implement the answer, and then investigate it to make sure we're sustaining it. And it's the same where we start with 2 data points. We look at it, we see where we can make savings, go, okay, I've got that, let's look at the next level. This iterative approach.
And it comes back as well to the point that communication is just so important when we're dealing with these things. When at least if we've set out our opportunities, set out the goals we want to achieve, and broken them down into little milestones, it means that when someone implements a project on one side of a factory, for instance, and something else has changed the other side of the factory, you're not scratching your head trying to figure out why the initial project hasn't worked or why it hasn't given the expected results. You know that in some other department, they've implemented changes, they're now doing their production in a different way, they're using more compressed air, whatever it happens to be. And at least now you actually have the complete picture. You're not just working on your own to try and achieve something.
A couple of questions we would always ask when we are looking at measuring the data is, do we have the correct data? First of all, is it the right instrumentation? One thing we've come across a lot of times before is people using the wrong type of instruments, like flow meters, where you've got heavy water deposits, where you've got caustic water, or where you've got high temperatures. We need to have the correct instrumentation for those installations. Or even, do we have an electrical meter that increments in the right scale, or we have the right CT ratio on it? It's a very small load that only increments in 10 or 100 kilowatt hour jumps, which means that we're only reporting on it every day or 2 days as opposed to every minute or 5 minutes. In that case, do we have the correct granularity? So if we have got a very large consumer that we want to look at fluctuations on, are we collecting it in enough granularity rather than just taking a meter reading every day? Are we taking an automated reading every minute, 5 minutes, 15 minutes? And then importantly, are those accurate? So we'd always suggest, we're trying to get rid of manual readings where possible, but also as a fail-safe, making sure every now and then we take a reading and say, well, is the reading that I have for the last month matching up to a manual reading? Because perhaps something's changed. And over time we see drift in calibrations, so that's something to watch out for. How frequently have you calibrated your electrical meters? We see electricians get their fleet meters tested annually, pretty much. So are you doing the same thing? It doesn't have to be annually necessarily, but taking a good reading to compare it is important.
Yeah, the validation point is hugely important, and the great example at the bottom there, Niall, similar to what I mentioned earlier on, about a gas line, and tracking something like that. And it's only when you really start to dig into the data and you realize that there can be changes made in a site. We completely understand, and we come across it on a daily basis, that we deal with clients that have factories that are 100 years old, and in some cases they haven't changed a huge amount, but yet in other cases they've changed a lot, but certain things haven't been tracked, certain things haven't been noted, and what someone understood to be the case 20 years ago may not necessarily be the case now. And then we've come across sites that are absolutely brand new, state-of-the-art facilities, and yet still there's a lack of understanding around some of the metering that's there, some of the systems that are in place. And again, it's coming back to the why are we doing this? It's not necessarily just because you've always done it. It's because you have to kind of build a case around the most accurate way of reporting a lot of these findings. And
a lot of that comes down to people making the assumptions rather than asking first, what are we measuring? How are we measuring it? They just go, okay, that I know that feeds that line. So do you know? Have you gone and checked it? Is it the case? So a lot of you guys and ladies and the companies that we meet, they face challenges with data collection. So you need to learn how energy management can help the organization and embrace the disruptions and turn them into potential opportunities. So, yes, it can be annoying to have to switch off a line to put in meters, but understanding that ultimately that can lead to you to better performance and longer uptime is important. So things are never going to be 100% easy. There are going to be struggles, but why are we doing this at the end of the day? Always keep that vision in mind of where is our end goal and why are we doing this? So to overcome the challenge, we look at issues around data completeness. Do we have all the data we need? How do we get it in? Are we tackling the gaps? Are we putting in new metering? That's something that Phil and his team get heavily involved in, is we're looking at what's the best way to implement a solution, what additional meters are needed, because a lot of the time, sometimes calculated consumptions can be okay, but as you said, how you think the plant works isn't necessarily the whole case. So you might need to add some more metering, and it might cost a couple £100 to put in another electrical meter, but it's important at times to really get a better picture.
And I think it's also important to say that these kind of things can be done in stages, very similar to how we're trying to break these things down into milestones. We've come across sites that don't have, some large SEUs metered. That's some low-hanging fruit right there. You go and get a small budget for putting some metering or instrumentation on some of your really, really heavy consumers on site. That's going to tell you a huge amount, and you can build it on from there. We've gone to sites where you can measure the lights in the office building, and yet they may not necessarily have a meter on one of their air compressors, and it can be a little bit that can be quite stark in terms of you're looking over here when there's so much opportunity, and yet you're looking at the wrong thing sometimes.
And I think that's important as well. Like, some of that kind of stuff has come up before, where because it wasn't in an opportunity register or a central location. You know, I've come across it on a building before where the reason that meter wasn't in place was because the equipment hadn't arrived by shutdown. They put in the compressor, and then everyone goes, great, compressor's installed, everything's done. And someone had forgotten to go back and make sure. So at the next shutdown, it's come on. So, you know, I've looked at loads where didn't quite think that the energy was accurate enough, and then visiting the site discovered that only one CT had been fitted. There's two dangling there in the system, so we're recording a third of the energy because someone forgot to go back at the next shutdown and implement that final tick on the checklist. Whereas if that's recorded and documented, you can revisit it and make sure it's done. So it's a proper documentation and planning. And
without that documentation, without that planning, you're kind of losing the battle against the decarbonisation process.
So I guess everyone, just to finish up, we're going to just touch before we get into the Q&A session on the 5 take-homes from today. So number 1, build your decarbonisation team. That shouldn't just be your EHS person or your accounts. It should be a mixture of every element of your team, of your company, your team, your facility, what have you, and educate all of the stakeholders, not just that team, but the wider company and everyone involved in the system. So, you know, okay, I'm not on the decarbonisation team. I still need to know why it's important to leave that system in auto control as opposed to put it into manual and override it and run it the way I used to. I still need to know why I need to flick off that switch at the end of the day, or why it's important, and how, if I spot an opportunity, do I report it? Then number 3, we want to look at make sure that everyone knows that everyone is responsible. It's not just that person. 4, revisit your targets regularly. So change your step goal. Once we've hit it 3-4 times a month, let's narrow that KPI a little bit, make it a bit stretchier, and try and achieve a better savings. And then finally, set those milestones in small bite-sized chunks. Don't just target 2050. Target, okay, Q4, Q1 next year, the end of next year. Where am I going to go to? Are we on schedule to hit it? 5% reduction next year, 10% the year after, not just the big whack of 50% in 5 years' time.
Absolutely. And I think those are, I think everyone can understand what's on the screen there. Everyone is probably in agreement as well that those things actually need to be done. And I think point number 3 is probably the most important one. We started off with it and we're probably finished with it here. It's just that everyone is responsible. Anyone that happens to set foot in your building or on your site is responsible, whether it happens to be the guy that's running the biggest boiler, biggest air compressor, running one of the most intensive processes on site, to the person that might be operating the power washer to clean the trucks that are coming in and out. And that's something that we see all the time as well.
Yeah, I think that really keys into the fact that, you know, the people who see the day-to-day operations on your site often have good insights into great ways to save carbon, you know, especially when we come to your scope 3 emissions and stuff coming into the system. They see the trucks that are delivering the goods, they see the wasted energy and stuff like that. They talk to the people from other companies and get those insights that you don't get at a different level. So they might spot opportunities, or they say, oh, you know, I was up in that factory up the road and they had just done this project. It looks great. So, you know, listen to everyone on the plant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Guys, that was really great. Thank you very much. Couple of questions. Phil, this is direct to you. What's the data collection methods for this? Is it a sensor?
No, data collection method can be pretty much anything. So what we've discussed here today, we haven't, you know, focused too much on, you know, the technical aspects of it. But in terms of data collection, it can be anything that is recording data at the moment, whether that be a pen and a piece of paper that ultimately gets filled into an Excel spreadsheet, or else we can be dealing with sites that have, you know, 1,000 data points coming from a SCADA system, a metering system. It could be a historian that they may have implemented for years, but weren't necessarily making good use of the data. You know, we can get into obviously very technical discussions, and quite happy to talk to that person, Sinead, if they do want more information. But, you know, we deal every day with instrumentation, everything from an electrical meter to flow meters, temperature sensors, pressure sensors, and all of that.
So I guess that's the point that you're making all along. It's like minimal amount of data and we can interpret it.
Exactly.
And you know, with our software, we're data agnostic. We don't care where it comes from. If you have a timestamp and a number to put with that timestamp, we can get it in. So
great question. Got quite a few questions here. So one person saying, do you have any tips or examples how to increase buy-in from all the team members? Like you've been talking about that. I guess it starts at the very beginning of the project. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, it starts at the beginning of the project. There's simple methods that we've seen people implement where they put in the screenshots, or they share dashboards within the canteen or within hallways and said, like, this is the achievement we've got and this is our goal. One of the other great ways is training education. So we partner with Rewrite, who would be a great
platform here. Rewrite.
Rewrite. We have an education platform that can help all of your team to understand about climate change and why it's important and why we need to decarbonize, and how to get involved. So that's one way that I would suggest is get a climate action awareness out there and an understanding of what it is. It's not just for tree huggers like me. It's for everyone. That's one way, and that feedback is important. So it's not just, you need to give us readings. This is what we're doing with those readings, and this is what we're achieving. It's feeding back into your team. Are we hitting our goals? Why we're doing it?
Now this one, you're going to have to bear with me. So for a non-techie person, so if I turn down my CHP plant in times of high wind to reduce the dispatch down of wind generation, my electricity consumption increases. Should my scope 2 emissions for this electricity be zero, or use the SEAI annual leverage carbon intensity? Now, is that for another person on our team to answer?
I think we might actually just get that person's details and get.
I have your details there, and Thomas, I'm going to email you, and I'll actually connect you with some people who can give you a really good answer on that. I'd say Mark could chat to that person.
I was going to say Mark would be an expert to talk to on that. He'd certainly be able to help.
So we're in the UK and have multiple building locations and sites that we manage. Legislation is coming in where we will need to provide building energy ratings. How would you suggest with dealing with that? Well,
that's the case study we showed earlier is exactly that, where we started with the gas meters. So we can integrate with data aggregators in our system. And what we would do is we'd build the sites, get the data from the aggregators, and we can start to produce a dashboard or a report per site, leading up into regional and higher level.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the really interesting things we're doing at the moment, we've probably just talked in the context of existing buildings and existing facilities at the moment. One of the really interesting things we're doing actually at the moment with the client is they are building brand new commercial buildings in Europe. And what they're using Clarity for is to actually model the optimum or the desired performance of a building. And then when the building is actually built, using the data from it to see how close they actually managed to get it.
Well, now, Phil, you've left yourself wide open for this one. So earlier in the masterclass, you mentioned a digital twin. Can you please explain this further?
I'll have a go, but all right, no problem.
Keep it very, very simple. Remember that we're running at the end of time here.
No problem at all. Yeah, a digital twin, I guess. I mean, look, let's take it in the context of the likes of a boiler, obviously something that has a huge amount of data attached to it. So, you're going to have on a boiler, typically it's a gas boiler, you're going to have gas flow in, you're going to have steam out potentially, and you're going to have water flows, and you're going to have various temperatures and pressures regarding that piece of plant.
Blow down,
exactly. Valve positions. There's a huge amount. I mean, one boiler could have potentially up to 100 data points associated.
Guys, don't get too technical.
So if we're to build a digital twin out of that, we're basically modeling the performance of that boiler. So pulling in all of those parameters, be it from a controller or whatever else, into Clarity or whatever your system happens to be, and then building out the model of that on Clarity, whatever you happen to be, and then looking at the performance of it. And then as you start to change certain parameters, you can then see how that is performing then over the next number.
A key part of it then as well is building the other equipment beyond that. So we've got our steam out. Okay, where's our steam into the next one? And then do we have a meter on both sides? Is there a difference between those meters? There's a loss in the distribution network somewhere. So it's representing your site, your areas, your equipment, and what we like to think of as your attributes and your assets and their attributes. Yeah. An asset being a boiler, a compressor, a fan, and the attributes being the measurable details of that. So yeah, gas in, steam out. Where does that lead to?
And the last thing on that as well, I mean, there's a lot we can do that with virtual points. You can see the performance of something without actually having to go and change something physically. You know, you can input variables into your software platform. Clarity can do it, and then see what the expected performance of that change is going to bring.
Mm-hmm. You're on mute, Sinead.
You're on mute, Sinead, there. Just
sorry, I just did a tractor going by outside. Sorry about that. We're just at the end, and we have a couple more questions that weren't answered. Anybody wants to set up a call with the guys, just email me and I can help do that, or we can email an answer to you. This is your last one.
Anyone else as well, if like that, there's a question that would our sister company would greatly help with, so passing on the information on to Mark. So if there's an area that you don't think we can help, but certainly one of our colleagues can.
So this is the last one now. The takeaway asides, how would you suggest managing these initiatives across several sites with little to no metering in the beginning? And is it enough to first just monitor things like electricity and gas if you're at a standing start? Very briefly, lads.
Yeah, from a standing start,
absolutely.
Take your bills, put those bills into a spreadsheet, look and see monthly. Okay, I've done it with my own house. I've taken every month for the last 4 years. I've got them in a spreadsheet, and I can see, okay, what change did I make that month? What change did I make the next month? And yeah, start with your multiple sites at a high level. It's very, very easy to say, okay, well, I know these 3 sites are roughly the same, should be the same performance. This one's operating better. What are they doing on that site that's operating better than the other one? Or they could be vastly different. And you can say, okay, well, that one's in the north where it's a lot colder. That one's in the south where it's sunnier. They have different consumers. They're not all the same. But yeah, start off with that. And then that can kind of help to see, well, which of those looks to have the biggest usage, and potentially I can start my initial budget can be spent on that building. Okay, what worked in that building? Let's move on to the next one. And as you go on, we talked about that iteration of the first building, put in metering. Okay, I had a bit of a gap in that design of metering, or this really worked for that metering, that building. Let's put on the second one. And then that's normally how we operate with customers. We start off with one plant as a test bed, proved value, go on to 3 plants, proved value, go on to 10, 20, 100 sites.
It's important to note as well that, you know, no 2 sites are the same. There can be obviously huge similarities depending on what the actual process of the manufacturing, it might be happen to be manufacturing. But again, no 2 sites are the same. You know, start with one, start with a pilot, see what worked on that one, see if it'll work in the other one. You know, we're not trying to eat the whole elephant here, is one of the ones we use quite a lot.
That helps get the buy-in, I think, as well. So if you've got one successful plant and you know, the team on that plant say, yeah, this really worked for us, it's easier to get the other sites to buy into it.
Okay, so guys, we're going to wrap up. Somebody's just asking there, we're going to share a copy of today's presentation. Yes, absolutely, we are. I'll be sending a recording out. Any questions you have, like I say, drop back into us. Guys, that was really, really good. Really simple steps, really useful. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Thanks for giving over nearly an hour of your time. I'll give you 8 minutes back.
Thanks very much, all. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.